When Michael and David Patterson inherited the collapsed ruins of St. Helena's Church, everyone in Millbrook thought they'd lost their minds. The old stone building had been abandoned for decades, its roof caved in, walls crumbling, and the once sacred space overrun with weeds and debris. Local residents whispered that the brothers were fools for keeping such worthless property instead of selling the land to developers. But as the brothers began clearing away years of rubble and decay, their shovels struck something unexpected beneath the altar. A hidden trapdoor, sealed for generations, led to a buried chamber that defied explanation. Inside lay ancient relics, mysterious documents, and artifacts that suggested St. Helena's held secrets. Far more valuable than anyone had imagined, what they discovered in that forgotten room would not only transform their understanding of the church's history, but challenge everything the town of Millbrook believed about its own past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, interrupting Michael Patterson's third cup of coffee and his review of quarterly sales reports. His brother David was hunched over architectural blueprints in the corner of their shared office, red pen in hand, making corrections to a residential project that had been giving them trouble for weeks. "Mr. Patterson, this is Eleanor Fitzgerald from Fitzgerald and Associates in Millbrook. I'm calling about your great-uncle Thomas Patterson's estate." Michael had barely known Thomas existed. The old man had been their grandfather's younger brother, a recluse who'd lived somewhere upstate and sent Christmas cards with $5 bills tucked inside when they were children. Michael couldn't remember seeing him more than twice in his entire life. "I'm afraid Uncle Thomas passed away last month," Eleanor continued in the practiced tone of someone who delivered such news regularly. "He's left you and your brother David some property in Millbrook. Could you come in to discuss the inheritance?" The drive to Millbrook took 3 hours through autumn countryside that grew progressively more rural as they left the suburbs behind. David navigated while Michael drove their work truck, both brothers speculating about what their mysterious great-uncle might have left them. Maybe a small house they could fix up and flip. Maybe just enough land to be worth something to a developer. Millbrook turned out to be the kind of small town that looked like it had been slowly dying for decades. Main Street was dotted with empty storefronts, their windows either boarded up or displaying faded "For Lease" signs that appeared to have been there for years. The few businesses that remained open, a diner, a hardware store, a combination gas station, and convenience market, looked like they were hanging on through sheer stubbornness rather than prosperity. Eleanor Fitzgerald's office occupied the second floor of what had once been a bank, back when Millbrook had been prosperous enough to support such institutions. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and the kind of practical manner that suggested she'd been handling the legal affairs of small-town families for most of her adult life. "Your great-uncle was quite specific about his wishes," she said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. "He wanted you boys to understand that this inheritance comes with certain responsibilities." The folder contained a deed to 4 acres of land on the outskirts of town, along with whatever structures remained on the property. There was also a letter, written in Thomas's careful handwriting on cream-colored paper that looked expensive. Michael read aloud, "To my great-nephews Michael and David, you probably don't remember me well, but I've kept track of your lives through your parents and grandparents. You've both grown into the kind of men who understand that some things matter more than money. The property I'm leaving you has been in our family for generations, held in trust for reasons that will become clear if you choose to accept the responsibility. The church may look worthless to others, but it holds secrets that must be protected. Don't let them convince you to sell. Honor the family duty that I can no longer fulfill." "Church?" David asked, looking up from his own copy of the letter. Eleanor nodded toward the window. "St. Helena's is about 2 miles east of town. It's been abandoned for, must be 30 years now. Your uncle bought it from the diocese when they were consolidating rural parishes. Paid good money for it too, though most folks couldn't understand why. She drove them out to see the property in her ancient Lincoln Continental, pointing out local landmarks along the way. The Kowalski farm, where 3 generations had raised dairy cattle until the market collapsed. The Mitchell place, where a young family had tried to start an organic operation before giving up and moving back to the city. The old gravel pit that had provided materials for road construction until environmental regulations shut it down. St. Helena's Church sat at the end of a dirt road that had seen better days, surrounded by overgrown fields and stands of maple and oak trees that were brilliant with fall color. Michael's first impression was that the building looked like it had been bombed. The roof had completely collapsed, leaving exposed stone walls that rose maybe 15 feet before ending in jagged edges, where timbers had once supported wooden beams and slate. Shingles, storm damage from about 15 years ago finished it off, Eleanor explained, picking her way carefully through the tall grass and scattered debris. Your uncle never had it repaired, but he wouldn't let anyone else touch it either. Paid property taxes faithfully every year, kept the access road maintained well enough for his truck. David was walking the perimeter, his architect's eye assessing the structural damage. Foundation looks solid, he called back to them. Stonework is actually pretty impressive for this area. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Michael found himself standing where the altar would have been, looking up through the open roof at grey October sky. Something about the place felt expectant, as if it were waiting for something to happen. The sensation was probably just his imagination, influenced by Thomas's cryptic letter and the obvious reverence with which their great-uncle had treated this pile of rubble. But as he stood there among the fallen stones and rotting timber, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas had left them more than just property. He'd left them a mystery that would require solving. The brothers returned the following weekend with a pickup truck full of basic tools and enough supplies to make a serious start on clearing the debris. Michael had spent the week thinking about Thomas's letter, particularly the phrase about family duty. David, ever the practical one, had researched the cost of demolition and land preparation, calculating whether the property might be worth something to developers, even in its current condition. They'd barely started, loading wheelbarrows with broken slate and rotted timber, when a woman approached from the direction of town, walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this landscape. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she spent significant time outdoors. "You must be the Patterson boys," she said, extending a dirt-stained hand. "I'm Emma Hartwell. I teach at the elementary school in town, but history is my real passion. I heard you'd inherited St. Helena's." Michael shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze of someone accustomed to dealing with skeptical audiences. "News travels fast around here. Small towns have their advantages," Emma replied with a smile. "Eleanor Fitzgerald mentioned you were planning to clean up the place. I was hoping I might be able to help, or at least document what you find before it gets hauled away." David straightened up from the pile of debris he'd been sorting. "Document what? It's just a bunch of old stones and rotted wood." Emma's expression suggested she'd heard similar dismissals before. "St. Helena's is older than most people realize. The architectural style suggests late medieval construction, probably 13th or 14th century. That would make it one of the oldest standing structures in this part of the state." She pointed to the stonework that formed the base of the walls, where carefully fitted blocks showed the kind of craftsmanship that had been built to last centuries. "See how these foundation stones are laid? That's not typical of colonial American construction. This looks like European technique, brought over by craftsmen who learned their trade in the old country." Michael found himself paying closer attention to details he'd overlooked during their first visit. The stones were indeed fitted with unusual precision, and there were carved details around what had once been doorways and window openings that suggested considerable skill and expense. "Why would someone build something this elaborate way out here?" David asked. That's what I've been trying to figure out for years, Emma admitted. The church doesn't appear in any of the standard histories of the area. It's not mentioned in county records until your great-uncle bought it from the diocese. And even then the paperwork is surprisingly sparse. As they worked through the morning, Emma proved to be genuinely helpful rather than just curious. She had a good eye for distinguishing between debris that could be discarded and fragments that might have historical significance. More importantly, she clearly knew the area's history in detail that went far beyond what might be found in standard reference books. It was Emma who spotted the carved stone fragment half buried under a pile of slate near where the altar would have been. Michael almost threw it into the discard pile before she stopped him. "Wait," she said, kneeling to examine the piece more carefully. "This isn't just decorative carving. The fragment was roughly the size of a dinner plate, carved from the same grey stone as the church's walls, but with much more elaborate detail. What had caught Emma's attention was a series of symbols carved around the edge, not random decoration, but what appeared to be text. "Latin," she said, after studying the markings for several minutes. "Medieval Latin from the look of the letter forms. I can make out part of it, Sancta Helena, Custodia Sacra. Something about sacred keeping or sacred guardianship." David set down his shovel and joined them in examining the stone. "So this really was St. Helena's church?" "St. Helena was the mother of Emperor Constantine," Emma explained. "She's credited with finding the true cross in Jerusalem during the 4th century. Churches dedicated to her often housed important relics." Michael felt an odd chill despite the warm October sunshine. "What kind of relics?" "Pieces of the true cross were the most common, but wealthy churches sometimes had other items, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of religious artifacts, manuscripts, the kind of things that would have been incredibly valuable to medieval Christians. They spent the rest of the day working with new purpose, examining each piece of debris more carefully before deciding whether to keep or discard it. Emma took photographs of anything that looked potentially significant, and Michael found himself thinking more seriously about Thomas's cryptic references to family responsibility and secrets that needed protection. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the ruins, Emma gathered her camera and notes. "I'd like to come back tomorrow if you don't mind. I want to research that stone fragment more thoroughly, see if I can translate the full inscription." After she left, the brothers continued working in companionable silence until the light began to fail. As they loaded their tools back into the truck, David voiced what Michael had been thinking all day. "You know, maybe Uncle Thomas wasn't as crazy as everyone thought." The Millbrook Town Council meeting was held in the basement of the volunteer fire department, in a room that smelled of coffee and old cigarette smoke, despite the no smoking signs posted on every wall. Michael and David had been invited to attend by a formal letter delivered to Eleanor Fitzgerald's office, though the tone suggested it was more of a summons than a request. About 30 residents filled the folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, most of them looking like they'd come straight from farm work or factory shifts. The brothers recognized a few faces from their weekend trips to the hardware store and diner, but the atmosphere felt distinctly unwelcoming. Marcus Reed dominated the front of the room even before the meeting officially started. He was a man in his 50s, well-dressed by local standards, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never being told no. His business card identified him as a land development consultant, though Emma had mentioned he seemed to be involved in most of the commercial property transactions in the county. "Before we get to regular business," Reed announced, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. These gentlemen have inherited what's left of the old church, and apparently they're planning to do something with it instead of selling it to someone who can put the land to productive use." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Michael felt David tense beside him, recognizing the same expression his brother wore when contractors tried to pressure them into cutting corners on job sites. "We're cleaning up the property," Michael said, standing to address the room. "Our great-uncle left it to us, and we're trying to honor his wishes." "Your great-uncle was a stubborn old fool," called out a woman from the back row. "That eyesore has been dragging down property values for 30 years. Reed nodded approvingly. The Patterson brothers might not realize it, but that land could be developed into something that would benefit the whole community. "I've got investors interested in building a truck stop and convenience center right there on the county road. Would bring jobs, tax revenue, customers for local businesses." "What kind of investors?" David asked. "The kind with deep pockets and business sense," Reed replied without really answering the question. "The kind who understand that sentiment doesn't pay bills or keep young people from leaving town." An older man Michael recognized as the hardware store owner stood up. "Now hold on, Marcus. These boys have every right to do what they want with their own property. And maybe some things are worth preserving, even if they don't turn a profit." "Easy for you to say, Frank," Reed shot back. "You're not trying to raise kids in a town where the biggest employer is a failing dairy operation, and half the businesses on Main Street are boarded up." The argument that followed revealed battle lines that had probably been drawn long before the Patterson brothers arrived in Millbrook. On one side were residents who saw progress in purely economic terms, who believed that any change was better than slow decline. On the other were people who valued history and community character, even if preserving those things meant accepting economic limitations. Emma arrived halfway through the meeting and took a seat near the back, but Michael noticed she didn't participate in the debate. She seemed to be watching and listening with the careful attention of someone gathering information rather than trying to influence outcomes. After an hour of increasingly heated discussion, Reed made his final pitch directly to the brothers. "I'm prepared to offer you boys twice what that land is worth on today's market. Cash, quick closing, no contingencies. You could walk away with enough money to buy something nice closer to home and never have to think about Millbrook again." The offer was substantial, more money than either brother had ever seen at one time. Michael felt the temptation of it, the appeal of taking the easy path that would solve immediate problems and eliminate future complications. But as they drove back to their motel that night, it was David who voiced what Michael had been thinking. "Did you notice how eager Reed was to get rid of us? Like he was afraid of what we might find if we kept digging around that church. You think he knows something we don't? I think Uncle Thomas wasn't the only one who thought that place was worth protecting." The next morning, they returned to St. Helena's to find evidence that someone had been there during the night. Tools had been moved, piles of sorted debris had been scattered, and several of the stone fragments Emma had marked for further study were missing entirely, but they also found something the intruders had apparently overlooked, a piece of parchment that had been wedged between two foundation stones, protected by oiled cloth that had kept it remarkably well preserved despite decades of weather exposure. The parchment contained handwritten text in what appeared to be Latin, along with decorative borders that suggested it had been torn from a much larger manuscript. Emma would need to see this immediately, but first they would need to make sure it didn't disappear like the stolen stone fragments. Someone in Millbrook definitely didn't want them to discover what St. Helena's was hiding. After 3 weeks of methodical clearing, the brothers had finally exposed the full outline of what had once been the church's altar area. The work had been backbreaking, hauling away tons of collapsed timber, broken slate, and accumulated debris that had built up over decades of neglect. But underneath all that destruction, they'd found something that made every aching muscle worth the effort. The altar platform was constructed from massive stone blocks that had been fitted together with medieval precision. Unlike the rough fieldstone used for much of the church's walls, these blocks showed evidence of skilled carving and careful planning. More intriguingly, the platform appeared to be hollow underneath, supported by arched stonework that created a space large enough for a person to crawl through. It was David who noticed that one section of the altar floor looked different from the rest. Where most of the stone surface was worn smooth by centuries of use, This particular area showed signs of having been deliberately sealed with mortar that didn't quite match the original construction. "Hand me that crowbar," David said, kneeling to examine the suspicious section more closely. "I think we've got some kind of access panel here." Michael positioned himself to provide leverage while David worked the crowbar into the narrow gap where old mortar met older stone. The seal had been strong when it was new, but decades of freeze-thaw cycles had created hairline cracks that allowed them to gradually pry loose the protective covering. What they revealed beneath made both brothers stop working and stare. Trapdoor had been cut into the altar floor with the same precision that characterized the rest of the church's stonework. Heavy iron hinges, green with age but still solid, supported a stone slab that had been carefully shaped to fit the opening exactly. An iron ring large enough for a man's hand provided the means to lift the door. "Jesus," Michael whispered, then immediately felt embarrassed for swearing. In what had once been sacred space, David was already examining the hinges and lifting mechanism with his architect's eye for structural details. "This wasn't added later. This is original construction. Someone built this church with this hidden access from the very beginning." The iron ring was cold under Michael's hands as he gripped it and pulled. The stone slab was heavier than he'd expected, requiring both brothers to lift it safely. As the trapdoor opened, a draft of cool air rose from the darkness below, carrying scents of old stone and something else, something that reminded Michael of the incense used in the Catholic churches of his childhood. They played their flashlight beams into the opening, revealing carved stone steps that descended into what appeared to be a substantial underground chamber. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each step had been individually shaped to fit precisely with its neighbors, and the walls showed the same attention to detail that characterized the church above. "We need better lights," David said practically, "and probably some safety equipment. We don't know how stable this is after all these years." Michael agreed, but he also felt an urgency that had nothing to do with practical concerns. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to create this hidden space, and Thomas's letter suggested that the family had been entrusted with protecting whatever lay down there. If Marcus Reed and his allies were willing to steal artifacts from the church ruins, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to explore an underground chamber once they learned of its existence. 5 minutes, Michael said, lowering himself through the opening. "Just a quick look to see what we're dealing with." The chamber was larger than the flashlight beam could fully illuminate. But even in the limited light, Michael could see that it was much more than a simple storage space. The walls were lined with stone shelves, and the floor was paved with the same carefully fitted blocks used in the church above. Most remarkably, the space felt dry and well-preserved, as if the medieval builders had understood principles of ventilation and moisture control that kept their underground construction habitable across centuries. David joined him, and together they played their lights across walls that held what appeared to be dozens of objects wrapped in dark cloth. The preservation was remarkable. Whatever the medieval builders had stored down here had been protected from the weather, temperature fluctuations, and moisture that would have destroyed such items anywhere else. "Look at this," David said, directing his light toward a wooden table near the center of the chamber. An ornate iron key lay on the table's surface, its metal decorated with symbols that neither brother could immediately identify. Michael picked up the key, noting its substantial weight and the quality of the metalwork. One end was shaped into what appeared to be a papal seal, the crossed keys that symbolized the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. The other end was designed to fit a lock of considerable sophistication. "This isn't just any key," Michael said, studying the papal symbols in the flashlight beam. "This is something that was made for a very specific purpose." As they prepared to climb back to the surface, both brothers understood that they'd crossed a threshold. Whatever Thomas had meant about family duty and sacred trust, it was connected to this hidden chamber and the treasures it contained. But they also understood that they were no longer alone in their knowledge. Someone had been watching them, following their progress, waiting for exactly this kind of discovery. The key felt warm in Michael's pocket as they climbed back into daylight, and he wondered what lock it was meant to open. They returned the next morning with proper equipment: LED lanterns, extension cords, and a portable generator that would give them adequate light to properly explore the underground chamber. Emma arrived shortly after they set up their lighting system, carrying a digital camera and what appeared to be several reference books. "I've been researching that manuscript fragment you found," she said without preamble. The Latin text mentions something called the Sacred Trust of Helena, and references to guardians of the true faith. "I think your great-uncle was right about this place being more important than anyone realized." The chamber looked entirely different under proper illumination. What had seemed large in flashlight beams revealed itself to be enormous, a vaulted space that extended far beyond what should have been possible given the church's above-ground footprint. The medieval builders had clearly excavated well beyond the church's walls, creating an underground complex that could have housed a small community. The stone shelves that lined the walls held more treasures than they'd initially realized. Carefully wrapped bundles filled every available space, each one tagged with symbols that appeared to be some kind of cataloging system. The preservation was extraordinary. Whatever wrapping materials the medieval builders had used, they'd been effective across centuries of storage. Emma approached the nearest shelf with the reverence of someone who understood she was looking at irreplaceable historical artifacts. "We need to be incredibly careful here," she said, pulling on cotton gloves she'd brought for handling delicate materials. "If these items are as old as I think they are, exposure to air and light could cause immediate damage." Michael picked the largest bundle from the central shelf, noting its substantial weight and the quality of the dark silk cloth that wrapped it. As he carefully unfolded the wrapping, all three of them held their breath. Inside was a book unlike anything Michael had ever seen. The cover was bound in leather that had darkened with age, but remained supple and intact. Gold leaf decorated the edges of pages that appeared to be made from vellum rather than paper. Most remarkably, the front cover bore an illuminated illustration that seemed to glow even in the artificial light of their LED lanterns. The illustration depicted a woman in royal robes, holding what appeared to be a large wooden cross. Her face was serene and determined, and the artist had surrounded her with symbols that suggested both earthly authority and divine mission. Below the illustration, text in elaborate medieval script identified the subject as Sancta Helena, Inventrix Crucis, St. Helena, discoverer of the cross. "This is incredible," Emma whispered, carefully opening the book to reveal pages covered with illuminated text and detailed illustrations. "This appears to be a complete hagiography, a saint's life story, written and illustrated by medieval scribes. Look at the quality of the artwork, the gold leaf, the detail in the calligraphy. This would have taken years to complete and cost a fortune to commission." As Emma carefully turned pages, the book revealed its contents to be far more than a simple religious biography. The text described Helena's journey to the Holy Land in search of Christian relics, but it also included detailed maps, architectural drawings, and what appeared to be inventories of artifacts she'd discovered. According to this, Emma said, translating passages as she read, Helena didn't just find pieces of the true cross in Jerusalem. She discovered an entire collection of relics from Christ's crucifixion, nails, pieces of the crown of thorns, fragments of the burial shroud. And she didn't keep them all in one place. The implications were staggering. If the manuscript was authentic, it suggested that St. Helena had deliberately scattered the most sacred relics of Christianity across multiple locations, creating a network of hidden repositories that would protect them from persecution or destruction. "Look at this page," Emma said, pointing to an illustration that showed a building remarkably similar to the church above them. "This is definitely St. Helena's. The architectural details match exactly: the arched windows, the stone construction, even the position relative to the surrounding landscape." The manuscript, indicated that this particular location had been chosen to house one of the most significant relics in Helena's collection, a substantial fragment of the true cross itself, along with supporting documentation that would prove its authenticity to church authorities. "If this is real," Michael said slowly, "we're not just talking about historical artifacts. We're talking about items that would be considered among the most sacred relics in Christianity." Emma nodded, her expression reflecting the weight of what they'd discovered. The kind of relics that people have died trying to protect. The kind that would be worth killing for. As they continued examining the manuscript, they found additional evidence of the chamber's purpose. The text described a network of guardian families who had been entrusted with protecting various relic repositories. These families had been sworn to secrecy and charged with maintaining the sites across generations, passing knowledge and responsibility from parents to children through carefully guarded traditions. The Patterson family name appeared on several pages, listed among the guardian families for this particular site. According to the manuscript, they had been protecting St. Helena's secrets for over 6 centuries. "That's why Thomas left you the property," Emma said. "It wasn't just an inheritance. It was the continuation of a sacred trust that your family has been maintaining since medieval times." Michael felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. They weren't just property owners anymore. They were the latest generation in a line of guardians stretching back to the age of kings and crusades, entrusted with protecting relics that millions of people would consider among the most sacred objects on earth. But as they prepared to explore more of the chamber's treasures, Michael also understood that they were no longer dealing with simple small-town politics or even ordinary greed. If word of their discoveries reached the wrong people, they would be facing enemies who would stop at nothing to claim these relics for themselves. The ornate iron key from the chamber table proved to fit a locked wooden chest they'd discovered on one of the lower shelves. The chest itself was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, constructed from what appeared to be cedar with iron reinforcements that had kept it structurally sound across centuries of storage. Inside, nestled in faded silk padding, lay what Emma immediately recognized as one of the most significant religious artifacts they could have hoped to find. The silver reliquary was roughly the size and shape of a large jewelry box, but its surface was covered with intricate engravings depicting scenes from the crucifixion. At its center, a crystal window revealed the relic contained within, a dark wooden fragment no larger than a man's thumb. "If this is what I think it is," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we're looking at a piece of the true cross itself." The reliquary bore authentication markings that Emma recognized from her graduate studies in medieval history. Latin inscriptions around the base identified it as having been blessed by Pope Sylvester the Fern in the 4th century and certified as authentic by the church hierarchy in Jerusalem. Additional markings indicated it had been housed in various locations throughout Europe before arriving at its current resting place. Michael found himself strangely moved by the artifact, despite his generally practical nature. Whether or not the wood fragment was actually from Christ's cross, it represented centuries of faith and devotion. People had risked their lives to protect this relic, had built secret chambers and established guardian families to ensure its preservation. "We need to be very careful about who knows we've found this," Emma warned. "Religious artifacts of this supposed authenticity have started wars. They've been stolen, fought over, used to justify everything from crusades to political coups." David was examining the chamber's security measures with his architect's understanding of structural engineering. "Look at how this place was designed," he said, pointing to features they'd missed during their initial exploration. Multiple ventilation shafts to prevent moisture buildup, stone construction that would withstand fire or flooding, hidden access that would be nearly impossible to find without specific knowledge. "And look at this," Michael added, indicating symbols carved into the walls near each storage shelf. "These match the markings on that manuscript page we found earlier. Someone created a complete cataloging system for everything stored down here. As they continued their exploration, they discovered that the reliquary was just the beginning. The chamber contained dozens of other items that Emma identified as potentially priceless religious artifacts. Fragments of saints' bones in ornate containers, pieces of medieval religious art, manuscripts that could rewrite understanding of early Christian history. But they also found evidence that they weren't the first people to discover the chamber in recent years. Dust patterns on some shelves suggested items had been moved and replaced, and Emma noticed that several catalog symbols didn't match the artifacts currently in those locations. "Someone's been down here before us," she said grimly. "Recently, from the look of things. Items have been moved, possibly removed entirely." Michael felt his stomach tighten. "Thomas, what do you mean?" "Uncle Thomas must have known about the chamber. He probably came down here regularly, maybe moved some of the most important pieces somewhere even safer." The implication was troubling. If Thomas had felt the need to hide certain artifacts beyond even this secure location, he must have believed that the chamber itself was compromised or under threat, as if summoned by their concerns. They heard voices from above, multiple people moving around the church ruins with equipment that sounded heavier and more sophisticated than the basic tools tourists or casual visitors might carry. Michael quickly extinguished their lanterns and motioned for silence. Through the trapdoor opening, they could hear Marcus Reed's distinctive voice directing what sounded like a systematic search of the church grounds. "The old man had to have hidden the good stuff somewhere," Reed was saying. "Nobody spends 30 years protecting a pile of rubble without a damn good reason." "What about that historian woman?" another voice asked. "She's been sniffing around asking questions in town. Emma Hartwell thinks she's smarter than she is," Reed replied dismissively. "Small-town schoolteacher playing amateur archaeologist. She doesn't have the resources or connections to cause real problems." David leaned close to Michael's ear. "There's another way out," he whispered, indicating a passage they'd noticed earlier leading away from the main chamber. "We need to get out of here before they find the trapdoor." The passage proved to be part of an elaborate underground network that connected the church chamber to what appeared to be several other locations in the area. Medieval engineers had created a sophisticated system of tunnels and storage areas that would have allowed the Guardian families to move artifacts quickly and secretly in times of danger, as they made their way through the tunnels by flashlight. Emma clutched the silver reliquary against her chest. Whatever else happened, they couldn't allow this priceless artifact to fall into the hands of people who saw it only as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Behind them, they could hear the search continuing above ground, growing more systematic and determined. Reed and his associates clearly knew more about the church's secrets than they'd initially revealed, and they had the resources to mount a serious effort to claim whatever treasures the site contained. The tunnel eventually emerged through a concealed entrance in the woods nearly half a mile from the church. As they caught their breath in the gathering dusk, Michael realized that their simple inheritance had become something much more dangerous and complex. They were now the guardians of artifacts that represented not just historical significance, but spiritual meaning for millions of people around the world. And they had enemies who would stop at nothing to take that responsibility away from them. Emma's cottage was filled with the organized chaos of serious research. Historical documents covered every surface of her dining room table, while her computer displayed scanned images of medieval manuscripts she'd found in online archives. The silver reliquary sat in the center of it all, catching the light from her desk lamp like a beacon. "I've been up all night working on this," she said, indicating the papers spread before them. "What we found in the chamber isn't just valuable, it's historically revolutionary." She pulled out a document that appeared to be a photocopy of an old charter. This is the original founding document for Millbrook, dated 1847. But look at this language carefully. The town wasn't established for farming or logging like most settlements in this area. It was founded specifically as a guardian community to protect sacred holdings of ancient provenance. Michael studied the formal language of the 19th century document. Between the flowery legal phrases, the meaning was clear. Millbrook had been created for the sole purpose of maintaining and protecting the church and its hidden treasures. The founding families were all descendants of the original guardian bloodlines. Emma continued. Pattersons, obviously, but also Hartwell, Reed, Kowalski, and about 6 others. Each family was assigned specific responsibilities. Some maintained the physical site, others preserved the knowledge, still others provided security. David looked up from another document he'd been examining. Reed is descended from the guardian families. Marcus Reed's great-great-grandfather was one of the most trusted guardians, Emma confirmed. The Reed family was responsible for maintaining the legal protections that kept the church property safe from outside interference. The implications were staggering. The entire structure of the community had been designed around protecting St. Helena's secrets, with each family playing a specific role in an elaborate centuries-long conspiracy. So what happened? Michael asked. Why is Marcus trying to destroy what his ancestors spent generations protecting? Emma's expression darkened. Money happened, and the gradual erosion of belief in the sacred duty. Look at this. She showed them a series of land transaction records dating from the 1970s and 80s. Starting about 40 years ago, several of the guardian families began selling their properties and moving away. The knowledge that had been passed down through generations started dying out as younger family members chose different lives. But not all the families abandoned their duties, David observed. No, some remained faithful. Your great-uncle Thomas was one of the last true believers. My grandmother was another. She passed the family knowledge down to me before she died. Frank Kowalski, who owns the hardware store, still honors the old ways. But we've become a minority. Emma pulled out what appeared to be a family tree diagram, with names and dates stretching back centuries. The Reed family line shows something interesting. Marcus's grandfather broke with tradition in the 1960s. Instead of passing down the knowledge of protection, he started treating the family secrets as business opportunities. What kind of business opportunities? Selling information to collectors and dealers who specialize in religious artifacts. The grandfather made quite a bit of money, revealing the locations of some minor relic sites in other parts of the country. Marcus has continued that tradition, but with much higher stakes. Michael felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. That's why Reed was so eager to buy our property. He knows what's hidden there, and he's probably already got buyers lined up. Worse than that, Emma said grimly. I think he's been systematically looting other guardian sites for years. The wealth that's allowed him to become the dominant land developer in this area didn't come from legitimate business success. She showed them newspaper clippings from various regions, all describing thefts from historic churches and religious sites. The pattern was subtle but consistent, always locations that weren't well documented, always items that wouldn't be immediately missed, always in communities where the original guardian families had died out or moved away. Reed has turned the guardian network into his personal treasure map, Emma concluded. And St. Helena's represents the biggest prize of all, the central repository that the other sites were designed to protect. David was studying the founding charter more carefully. This document gives the guardian family's legal authority over the church site in perpetuity. It supersedes any later claims or sales, which means Reed can't legally take the property through normal channels, Michael realized. That's why he's been trying to pressure us into selling voluntarily, Emma nodded. But it also means we have legal weapons to fight back with, if we're brave enough to use them. The original charter was filed with the county, and it's never been superseded or revoked. In legal terms, the Patterson family has been designated as the primary guardians, with authority to make decisions about the site's preservation and protection. As they continued examining the documents, Michael felt the weight of their situation settling more heavily on his shoulders. They weren't just dealing with a local land dispute or even simple greed. They were caught in the middle of a centuries-old struggle between families who honored their sacred duties and those who had chosen to exploit them for personal gain. But they also had allies, other guardian families, who had remained faithful to their heritage, legal protections that went back to the town's founding, and most importantly, the moral authority that came from protecting something genuinely sacred. The question was whether they had the courage and resources to fight against enemies who had been planning this confrontation for decades. Frank Kowalski's hardware store stayed open late on Thursday evenings to accommodate farmers who couldn't get to town during regular business hours. When Michael and David arrived just before closing, they found Frank in the back room, carefully cataloging inventory with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details mattered. "Figured you boys would show up eventually," Frank said without looking up from his clipboard. "Emma told me you've been learning about family history." He led them to a storage room behind the main shop, where he moved aside several boxes of plumbing supplies to reveal an old safe built into the concrete floor. The combination took him 3 tries to remember, but when the heavy door finally swung open, it revealed contents that made the brothers understand why Frank had been so careful about privacy. Nestled in protective cloth lay a heavy gold ring, its surface worn smooth by generations of wear. The signet bore a complex design that combined Christian symbols with heraldic elements, and around the band, Latin text identified it as belonging to the Custodia Sanctae Helenae, the guardianship of Saint Helena. "This has been passed down through 6 generations of Kowalskis," Frank explained, handling the ring with obvious reverence. "Each head of family wears it during their time as guardian, then passes it to the next generation when they're ready to take on the responsibility." Michael examined the ring more closely, noting the quality of the craftsmanship and the weight that suggested solid gold construction. "How many families still have these?" 3, as far as I know. Mine, Emma's grandmother, left her one that she keeps locked away. And there's supposed to be 1 in your family line, though I'd guess Thomas hid it somewhere safe." Frank returned the ring to its protective wrapping and locked the safe again. The rings serve 2 purposes. They're proof of authority when dealing with other guardian families, and they're keys. Keys to what? That's what I was hoping you could tell me. My grandfather said each ring opens something different, something important to the overall protection system. But the knowledge of what got lost when my father died young in a farming accident. Frank led them back into the main store, where he poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since morning. "Emma says you found the main chamber under the church, along with some things that Reed is very interested in acquiring," David said carefully. Frank nodded grimly. "Reed's been working this community for 20 years, slowly turning people against the old ways. Half the families don't even remember they're supposed to be guardians. The other half think it's just folklore that doesn't matter anymore, but some families have stayed faithful. The Hartwells, obviously. Emma's got more knowledge than the rest of us combined. The Kowalskis have always honored our duties, even when we didn't fully understand them. And there's Sarah Martinez. She runs the diner. Her maiden name was Brennan, another guardian family." Frank pulled out a worn notebook and showed them a hand-drawn map of the town with various properties marked in different colors. "We've been keeping track of which families still remember their obligations. It's not many, but it might be enough if we work together." "Enough for what?" "Enough to stop Reed from destroying everything our ancestors died to protect." The notebook contained detailed observations spanning years of careful watching. Reed's business dealings, his associates from outside the community, his systematic acquisition of properties that had once belonged to guardian families. Frank had been documenting evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond simple land development. Reed's got backing from collectors who specialize in religious artifacts, Frank explained. People with enough money to buy entire collections without asking too many questions about provenance. He's been promising them access to the St. Helena treasures for years. How do you know all this? Small towns have their advantages. People talk, especially when they've had a few drinks at the American Legion on Friday nights. Reed's not as careful as he thinks he is about keeping his business private. Frank showed them photographs he'd taken surreptitiously of Reed meeting with well-dressed strangers who clearly weren't local residents. These meetings have been happening more frequently since you boys inherited the church. I think Reed's under pressure to deliver on promises he's made. David studied the photos carefully. Some of these people looked like they might be foreign. European, maybe? That would make sense, Frank said. The market for medieval religious artifacts is mostly overseas. American collectors tend to be more interested in Civil War memorabilia and Native American items. As they prepared to leave, Frank handed Michael a business card with only a phone number written on it. "That's my direct line. If Reed or his people cause you any trouble at all, you call me immediately. The Guardian families look out for each other, even when we're outnumbered." Walking back to their truck, Michael felt both reassured and sobered by the evening's revelations. They had allies in their struggle to protect the church's treasures, people who understood the historical and spiritual significance of what they'd inherited. But they also faced enemies with substantial resources and decades of planning, people who saw the sacred artifacts as nothing more than valuable commodities to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. The Guardian families had protected these treasures for over 6 centuries, through wars and religious persecution, through the rise and fall of empires. Now it was Michael and David's turn to prove worthy of that trust, to demonstrate that some things remain more important than money. Even in an age when everything seemed to be for sale, Emma's discovery came at 3 in the morning. When she was cross-referencing medieval architectural drawings with the layout of the underground chamber they'd explored. She'd been working with the illuminated manuscript from the church, using a magnifying glass to examine details in the decorative borders that hadn't been immediately obvious. Hidden within the ornate scrollwork that framed the main text, she found what appeared to be a coded map. The design elements weren't just decorative, they were a carefully disguised blueprint, showing the underground tunnel network that connected St. Helena's to other locations throughout the area. She called Michael immediately, despite the hour. "You need to see this. The manuscript isn't just a religious text, it's an instruction manual for the entire Guardian system." When the brothers arrived at Emma's cottage an hour later, she had the manuscript open on her dining room table, surrounded by modern maps of Millbrook and the surrounding countryside. Using colored pencils, she traced the routes indicated in the medieval decoratives. Borders onto contemporary topographical surveys. "Look at this," she said, pointing to correlations between the ancient map and current landmarks. "The tunnel system is enormous. It connects the church to at least 6 other locations in the area, including places where Guardian families built their homes." The coded map revealed a sophisticated network that would have allowed the Guardians to move artifacts quickly and secretly. Throughout the community, tunnels connected the church to the site where Frank Kowalski's farmhouse now stood, to the location of Emma's cottage, and to several other properties that had remained in Guardian family hands across generations. "But look at this route," Emma continued, indicating a tunnel that appeared to extend beyond the current boundaries of Millbrook. "This goes to what's now the Reed property, the old family farm that Marcus inherited from his grandfather." Michael studied the map more carefully. So Reed would have access to the tunnel system from his own land. "Not just access," Emma said grimly. "According to this, the Reed property was one of the main security stations for the entire network. The tunnels converged there before continuing to the church. If someone controlled that location, they could monitor or intercept anything moving through the system. David traced the routes with his finger, noting how the medieval engineers had planned for multiple contingencies. There are alternate routes for every major connection. Even if one section was compromised, the Guardians could still move between locations, which explains why Thomas was so concerned in his final years, Emma added. If Reed controlled the central monitoring station, he would have known about any activity in the tunnels. Thomas probably realized that the entire system was compromised. As they continued studying the coded map, Emma showed them another discovery she'd made during her night-long research session. Scattered throughout the manuscript's pages were what appeared to be inventory symbols, small, marks that corresponded to artifacts stored in various locations throughout the network. Each storage location had specific types of items, she explained. The church chamber held the most important relics and documents. But there were secondary repositories for items that needed different kinds of protection or climate control. One symbol particularly caught Michael's attention, a small medallion-shaped marking that appeared repeatedly near the illustrations of the central monitoring station. What does this one represent? Emma consulted notes she'd made throughout the night. Near as I can tell, it indicates items that were kept at the security station itself. Things that needed to be immediately accessible in case the Guardians had to evacuate the main repository quickly. The implications were troubling. If the Reed property had served as the security hub for the Guardian network, and if it contained its own cache of artifacts, then Marcus Reed had been sitting on a treasure trove of religious relics for his entire life. That's probably how he learned about the value of the Guardian collections, David realized. His family had access to artifacts they could sell to fund their betrayal of the other Guardian families. Emma nodded, but her expression suggested she'd found something even more concerning. There's something else. According to the manuscript, the items stored at the security station weren't just valuable, they were dangerous. Dangerous how? The text describes certain artifacts that were considered too powerful or controversial for general storage. Items that could cause religious or political upheaval if they became known to the wider world. She showed them a passage written in darker ink, as if the medieval scribes had wanted it to stand out from the rest of the text. This section talks about seals of ancient authority and tokens that command the faithful. It suggests that some of the artifacts stored in the Guardian network weren't just historically significant, they were politically significant as well. Michael felt a chill as he considered what Emma was suggesting. Religious artifacts that could command the faithful, seals of ancient authority. These weren't just museum pieces. In the right hands, they could be used to influence or manipulate people who considered them sacred. If Reed has been selling these kinds of artifacts to private collectors, David said slowly, he's not just committing theft, he's potentially destabilizing religious institutions around the world. Emma's research had revealed that they were dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than simple greed. The Guardian network hadn't just been preserving historical artifacts. It had been containing items that could reshape religious and political power structures if they fell into the wrong hands. And Marcus Reed had been systematically feeding those items into black market networks for decades, with St. Helena's representing the ultimate prize in his campaign to monetize centuries of sacred trust. The entrance to the tunnel system from the church side was hidden behind what appeared to be a natural formation of fieldstone in the underground chamber's deepest corner. Michael would have missed it entirely if David hadn't noticed that the mortar joints didn't quite match the rest of the medieval stonework. Working by LED headlamp, they carefully removed several loose stones to reveal a passage just tall enough for a person to move through while crouching. The tunnel walls showed the same quality of construction as the chamber itself, carefully fitted stone blocks that had remained stable across centuries of seasonal ground movement. Emma had stayed behind to continue researching the coded map, but she'd provided them with detailed directions based on her interpretation of the medieval symbols. According to her calculations, they should be able to follow the tunnel network directly to the area beneath Reed's property, where the central monitoring station was supposed to be located. The passage extended much farther than either brother had expected. After 20 minutes of careful movement through increasingly narrow tunnels, they began to understand the scope of the medieval engineering project. The Guardian families hadn't just built a simple hiding place. They'd created an underground transportation network that would have been impressive even by modern standards. The tunnel walls gradually changed character as they moved away from the church. The carefully fitted stone blocks gave way to rougher construction, then to passages that appeared to have been carved directly from natural bedrock. In several places, they found evidence of more recent modifications, electrical conduit and modern ventilation equipment that had been added long after the original construction. "Someone's been maintaining this system," David observed, noting PVC pipes that carried what appeared to be communication cables. These installations looked like they were done within the last 20 years. Michael was studying scratch marks on the tunnel walls that suggested regular passage of people and equipment. Reed must have been using these tunnels for his artifact smuggling operation. This is how he's been moving stolen items without anyone in town seeing the transportation. As they continued deeper into the network, they began encountering side passages that branched off toward other destinations. Some were blocked with modern gates secured by heavy padlocks, while others had been deliberately collapsed to prevent access. The pattern suggested systematic control over who could move through which parts of the tunnel system. It was in one of these side passages that they made their most significant discovery. Hidden behind a grate that had been disguised to look like a natural rock formation, they found a chamber that appeared to be actively used for storage. Modern shelving held dozens of wooden crates, each marked with shipping labels that indicated destinations around the world. Michael forced open one of the crates, revealing artifacts that were clearly much older and more valuable than anything a legitimate dealer would have access to. Religious statuary that showed the patina of centuries, manuscripts in protective cases that looked like they belonged in major museums, metalwork that appeared to be medieval in origin. "This is Reed's distribution center," David said, examining shipping labels that showed addresses in London, Geneva, and New York. He's been running a full-scale smuggling operation out of these tunnels, but it was the contents of a crate marked for shipment to a private collector in Switzerland that made both brothers understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. Inside, carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue, was a bronze medallion. Unlike anything they'd seen in the church chamber, the medallion was roughly the size of a dinner plate, its surface covered with symbols that appeared to combine Christian iconography with much older designs. At its center, a raised seal showed two crossed keys beneath a papal crown. But surrounding that central image were markings that seemed almost ancient, possibly predating Christianity entirely. "Look at the weight of this thing," Michael said, struggling to lift the medallion with one hand. "This isn't just bronze. There's probably gold alloy in here, maybe even precious stones set into some of these symbols." David was examining the medallion more closely with his flashlight. "These aren't just decorative symbols. Look at the wear patterns around the edges. This was designed to be used for something, not just displayed." As they continued examining Reed's storage facility, they found evidence that the medallion wasn't unique. Empty cases suggested that similar artifacts had already been shipped to collectors, while documentation indicated that several more pieces were expected to arrive from other Guardian sites that Reed had compromised. "He's been systematically looting the entire network," Michael realized. "Not just our site, but every Guardian family that lost track of their responsibilities." The shipping records revealed a pattern that went back decades. Reed had been targeting Guardian sites across multiple states, timing his thefts to coincide with family deaths or property transfers, when the artifacts would be most vulnerable to removal. but the records also revealed something more immediate and threatening. According to the shipping schedule they found, Reed was planning a major transfer of artifacts within the next few days, a shipment that would include items from the St. Helena's chamber that they hadn't even discovered yet. As they prepared to leave the storage facility, both brothers understood that they were no longer just protecting their inherited property. They were the last obstacle standing between Reed and the completion of a criminal enterprise that had been destroying sacred heritage for an entire generation. The medallion felt warm in Michael's hands as they made their way back through the tunnels, and he wondered what ancient ceremonies had required such an elaborate seal of authority. More importantly, he wondered what Reed's buyers planned to do with artifacts that had been designed to command religious obedience from the faithful. The betrayal came from someone they should have been able to trust completely. Sarah Martinez had seemed like a natural ally, a descendant of the Brennan Guardian family who ran the local diner and had always been friendly to the brothers during their time in Millbrook. When she offered to help them transport some of the more valuable artifacts to a secure location, it seemed like the logical next step in their efforts to protect the church's treasures. They arranged to meet her at the diner after closing time, bringing with them a selection of smaller artifacts that could be easily moved if Reed's people discovered the underground chamber. Emma had suggested keeping the most important pieces distributed among trusted Guardian families until they could establish better security measures. Sarah was waiting for them in the diner's back room, along with Frank Kowalski and a man they didn't recognize, someone she introduced as her cousin from Albany who had experience with historical preservation. The stranger seemed knowledgeable about proper handling techniques for medieval artifacts, and his questions about authentication and documentation appeared professionally informed. It was while Michael was showing them the bronze medallion they discovered in Reed's storage facility that he noticed Sarah's expression change. Her friendly demeanor shifted to something harder, more calculating, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with her supposed cousin that made Michael's instincts begin to sound alarms. "This particular piece is quite remarkable," the stranger said, examining the medallion with what Michael now realized was acquisitive rather than scholarly interest. The papal seals combined with these older symbols suggest a provenance that would be extremely valuable to certain collectors. "What kind of collectors?" David asked, his own suspicions clearly aroused. "The kind who understand that historical significance doesn't always align with legal ownership," Sarah replied, her tone no longer friendly. "Marcus Reed isn't the only person in this area who recognizes opportunity when it presents itself." The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't offered to help them protect the artifacts. She'd maneuvered them into bringing the most valuable pieces directly to her, where they could be stolen with minimal risk or effort. "The Brennan family abandoned their guardian duties 3 generations ago," she continued, seeming to enjoy their shock and dismay. "My great-grandfather figured out there was more money in selling information about guardian sites than in protecting them. Reed's been a useful partner, but he's not the only game in town." Frank Kowalski looked as stunned as the brothers felt. "Sarah, your grandmother told me you understood the family responsibilities. My grandmother was a sentimental old woman who never understood that the modern world doesn't have room for medieval superstitions." Sarah replied coldly. "The artifacts are valuable because people will pay for them, not because they're sacred." The stranger, who was clearly not Sarah's cousin, produced a small silver coin from his pocket and set it on the table between them. The coin was ancient, its surface worn nearly smooth by centuries of handling, but the basic design was still visible, 30 small marks arranged around the edge, with a central image that appeared to show a hanged man. "This represents the ultimate betrayal," the man said, with something approaching reverence. "One of the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas Iscariot for delivering Christ to his executioners." Your great-uncle Thomas spent years trying to acquire this particular coin, but he was never willing to pay what it was worth. Michael felt sick as he understood the symbolism. Sarah and her associates weren't just stealing artifacts for profit, they were actively collecting items that represented betrayal and corruption, as if they took pride in overturning centuries of faith and protection. "You're insane if you think we're going to let you walk out of here with those artifacts," David said, moving to position himself between Sarah and the door. "You don't really have a choice," Sarah replied, nodding toward her associate, who revealed that he was carrying a gun beneath his jacket. Marcus Reed's approach was always too crude, too obvious. He attracted attention with his heavy-handed tactics and his need to control everything directly. "We prefer more subtle methods." The man with the gun gestured for the brothers to step away from the artifacts they'd brought. "The beauty of betrayal is that it usually comes from people you trust." Reed could never understand that. He always had to intimidate and threaten. Sarah's family learned long ago that it's much easier to simply be invited into people's confidence. As they were forced to watch Sarah and her associate gather up the artifacts, Michael realized that the Guardian Network's greatest weakness wasn't external enemies like Reed. It was the gradual corruption of the families who were supposed to be its protectors. When Guardian bloodlines lost their sense of sacred duty, they became the most dangerous threats to the system they'd been entrusted to maintain. Frank Kowalski sat heavily in one of the diner chairs, looking older than his years. "How many other families have turned?" he asked quietly. "More than you know," Sarah replied, as she carefully wrapped the medallion in protective cloth. "And more every year, as people realize that sentiment doesn't pay bills or secure futures." The silver coin remained on the table as they prepared to leave, glinting in the fluorescent light like a challenge or a promise. Michael understood that they weren't just fighting for the artifacts anymore. They were fighting for the principle that some things remained sacred, even in a world where everything seemed to have a price. Emma's emergency phone call reached them just as they were leaving the diner, still reeling from Sarah's betrayal and the loss of several crucial artifacts. Her voice was tight with excitement and urgency as she explained what she'd discovered during her continued research into the church archives. "You need to get to my house immediately," she said. "I found something in Thomas's papers that changes everything. We have a legal weapon that can stop Reed permanently." They drove through the pre-dawn darkness, with Frank Kowalski following in his pickup truck, all of them understanding that time was running short. Sarah's betrayal had revealed that Reed's network of corrupt Guardian families was larger and more organized than they'd realized, and the brothers were increasingly outnumbered by enemies who had been planning for this confrontation for decades. Emma met them at her front door with a manila folder that appeared to contain official documents. "Thomas didn't just leave you the church property," she said, leading them quickly to her research area. "He left you something much more powerful." The document she showed them was a formal papal bull, written in Latin on heavy parchment and bearing multiple official seals. The paper was clearly ancient, but it had been preserved with the same care that had protected the other artifacts in the underground chamber. "This is a direct decree from Pope Pius IX, issued in 1847, Emma explained, her voice reflecting the significance of what she'd discovered. "It formally recognizes St. Helena's Church as a protected papal site under the direct authority of the Vatican. No civil government or private entity can legally interfere with the site or its contents without explicit permission from the Holy See." Michael studied the document, noting the elaborate calligraphy and the multiple authentication seals that marked it as a genuine papal decree. "This was issued the same year Millbrook was founded." "Exactly. The timing wasn't coincidental. When the Guardian families established the town, they also sought formal church protection for their mission. This document makes the church property legally equivalent to Vatican territory." David was examining the legal language more carefully. "So any attempt to force a sale or development would be a violation of international law." "More than that," Emma said, producing additional documents from Thomas's files. The papal bull also grants specific authority to the hereditary guardians to make decisions about the site's protection and preservation. As Thomas's heirs and the recognized guardian family, you have legal standing to invoke Vatican protection. Frank looked up from his own examination of the documents. Why didn't Thomas use this before? Why let Reed pressure him for years instead of just showing this to the authorities? Emma's expression darkened. Because Thomas was protecting more than just the church site. Look at this additional section. She pointed to passages in the papal bull that extended Vatican protection beyond the church itself to encompass all items, documents and sacred materials housed within the designated sanctuary. The language was broad enough to cover not just the artifacts in the underground chamber, but potentially everything that Reed and his associates had stolen from other guardian sites over the years. If we can prove that artifacts in Reed's possession originally came from protected papal sites, Michael realized, we can demand their return under international law. And we have that proof, Emma said, producing photographs of the shipping records they'd found in Reed's underground storage facility. These documents show systematic theft from sites that would have been covered by similar papal protections. The implications were staggering. Instead of being victims trying to protect a single site, they could become prosecutors with the authority to demand the return of stolen religious artifacts from across the entire network of corrupted guardian sites. But Emma's discovery came with urgent timing constraints. I've been in contact with the Vatican's Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology, she explained. They're sending a representative to authenticate the papal bull and assess the site. But he can't arrive until Monday. That gives us 3 days, David said. 3 days to prevent Reed from completing his final theft and disappearing with centuries of sacred heritage. Emma agreed. Frank was studying the papal bull more carefully. There's something else here. Look at this section about temporal authority during periods of threat. If I'm reading this correctly, the document grants guardian families the right to take whatever measures are necessary to protect the site until Vatican representatives can arrive. Michael felt pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Thomas hadn't been passive in the face of Reed's threats. He'd been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, assembling legal weapons that could stop the corruption permanently. But using those weapons would require courage that went beyond simple property protection. They would be invoking ancient authorities that hadn't been tested in the modern world, claiming rights that powerful people would fight desperately to prevent them from exercising. The papal bull felt heavy in Michael's hands as he realized that their inheritance had evolved from a simple property dispute into something approaching a holy war, with sacred artifacts and centuries of religious heritage hanging in the balance. They had the legal authority to fight back, but only if they were brave enough to claim it. The Vatican representative arrived on Sunday morning, earlier than expected and with more authority than Emma had initially understood. Father Alessandro Torretti was not simply an academic from the Pontifical Commission. He was a senior investigator with the Vatican's Art Recovery Department, an organization that specialized in tracking down stolen religious artifacts and prosecuting those who trafficked in sacred objects. Father Torretti appeared to be in his 50s, with the lean build and careful manner of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. He spoke fluent English with only a slight Italian accent, and his knowledge of medieval religious artifacts was immediately apparent as he examined the papal bull and other documents Emma had assembled. "This is extraordinary," he said after spending an hour reviewing their evidence. "We have been tracking artifacts from this network of guardian sites for several years, but we never understood the full scope of the theft or the legal protections that were being violated." He produced his own folder of documents, revealing that the Vatican had been conducting its own investigation into the black market trade in medieval Christian relics. Several items that had appeared in private Collections and auction houses had been traced back to sites in the American Midwest that matched the description of Guardian repositories. Your Mr. Reed and his associates have been more successful than we realized, Father Toretti continued, but they have also been more careless. Some of the artifacts they have sold carry Vatican authentication marks that make their theft a matter of canon law as well as civil law. Emma showed him photographs of the underground chamber and the artifacts they'd discovered there. Father Toretti's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He actually crossed himself when he saw the image of the silver reliquary containing the supposed fragment of the true cross. "If this is authentic," he said quietly, "it represents one of the most significant religious discoveries of the modern era. Artifacts of this importance were thought to have been lost during the Protestant Reformation or destroyed during various wars and persecutions, but it was when they showed him the cardinal's ring they'd found in the chamber that Father Toretti's demeanor changed from scholarly interest to urgent concern. The ring was heavy gold, with an elaborate design that incorporated both papal symbols and heraldic elements. And around the band, Latin text identified it as belonging to Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who had served under Pope Paul III in the 16th century. This ring was reported stolen from the Vatican museums in 1943, Father Toretti said, examining the artifact with obvious recognition. It disappeared during the German occupation of Rome, and we assumed it had been lost forever. How did it end up in a Guardian site in rural America? Michael asked. That is exactly what we intend to find out, Father Toretti replied grimly. But first, we must secure the remaining artifacts before they disappear into private collections where they will never be recovered. The priest's presence added both authority and urgency to their situation. He carried documents that gave him the power to invoke Vatican protection for the site immediately, without waiting for additional authentication or approval from church hierarchy. More importantly, he had contacts with American law enforcement agencies who specialized in international art theft. Your papal bull gives you legal standing to demand the return of any artifacts that were stolen from this protected site, Father Toretti explained. But it also gives the Vatican authority to pursue criminal charges against anyone who has knowingly trafficked in stolen religious objects. Emma showed him the shipping records they'd found in Reed's underground storage facility, which documented years of systematic theft from Guardian sites. Father Toretti's expression grew darker as he reviewed the evidence of how extensive the criminal network had become. These records show trafficking that extends far beyond simple theft, he said. This represents organized desecration of sacred sites on a scale that requires immediate intervention. As they prepared to return to the church site with Father Toretti, Michael felt the weight of their situation settling more heavily on his shoulders. They were no longer just protecting their inherited property. They were now working with international authorities to stop what appeared to be one of the largest religious art theft operations in modern history, but they were also racing against time. Reed and his associates clearly understood that their window for completing their theft was closing rapidly, and desperate criminals with millions of dollars at stake would not hesitate to use violence to protect their interests. The cardinal's ring felt warm in Michael's pocket as they drove toward the church, and he wondered what other secrets the Guardian sites might reveal once Vatican investigators began their systematic examination of the evidence. He also wondered whether they would live long enough to see justice served for the centuries of sacred trust that had been betrayed for profit. The final confrontation came not where they expected it, but in the deepest part of the underground chamber system, in a room they hadn't known existed until Father Toretti insisted on conducting a complete survey of the site. Using ground-penetrating radar equipment he'd brought from Rome, the priest had identified a sealed chamber beneath the main repository that appeared to contain the most significant artifacts. In the entire collection, opening the sealed chamber required the combined authority of all three guardian rings: Michael's, which they'd found in Thomas's papers, Frank's family ring, and, surprisingly, a third ring that Father Toretti carried as part of his Vatican credentials. The medieval builders had designed the ultimate security system, requiring ecclesiastical as well as hereditary authority to access their most precious treasures. Inside the final chamber, they discovered what Emma immediately recognized as the crown jewel of the entire St. Helena collection. Resting on a stone altar carved with symbols from Christianity's earliest period was an artifact that made even Father Toretti fall to his knees in reverence, a fragment of what appeared to be the crown of thorns itself, preserved in a crystal reliquary that had protected it for over 15 centuries. The authentication markings were unmistakable. Latin inscriptions identified the relic as having been recovered by St. Helena herself during her pilgrimage to Jerusalem, blessed by Pope Sylvester I and carried to safety during the barbarian invasions that destroyed much of early Christian Rome. The provenance documentation was more complete and authoritative than any religious relic Father Toretti had ever encountered. "If this is genuine," he whispered, "it represents the physical connection between Christ's passion and the modern church. This fragment has been venerated by saints and popes for over a millennium, but their moment of discovery was interrupted by sounds from the main chamber above, heavy equipment being moved, and voices that Michael recognized as belonging to Reed and his associates. The criminals had clearly been monitoring the site, waiting for the brothers to reveal the location of the most valuable treasures before making their final theft attempt. "They must have followed us through the tunnel system," David said grimly, checking the sealed entrance they'd used to access the final chamber. Father Toretti was already activating a GPS beacon that would alert Vatican security services to their location, but help was hours away. In the meantime, they were trapped in the deepest part of the underground complex, with the most valuable religious artifact any of them had ever seen. The sound of power tools echoing through the chamber system indicated that Reed's people were systematically breaking through the sealed entrances, following the same route they'd used to reach the final repository. Unlike previous confrontations, this time Reed clearly intended to take everything, regardless of who tried to stop him. "There's another way out," Frank said, studying architectural details in the final chamber that the others had missed. "Look at the ventilation patterns. These medieval builders always included emergency exits." He was right. Behind the stone altar, holding the crown of thorns fragment, they found a narrow passage that appeared to lead upward toward the surface. The passage was too small for equipment or large artifacts, but it would allow people to escape if the main entrances were compromised. As they prepared to evacuate with the crown of thorns relic, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of fleeing with the artifact, he carefully returned it to its protective reliquary and placed it back on the stone altar where it had rested for centuries. "What are you doing?" David demanded. "This belongs here," Michael said firmly. "We're not grave robbers or thieves. We're guardians. Our job is to protect these artifacts where they were meant to be preserved, not to run away with them when things get dangerous." Father Toretti understood immediately. "You are invoking sanctuary protection. The artifact remains in consecrated space, under Vatican authority, regardless of who tries to claim the site." "Will that legal protection actually stop Reed?" Emma asked practically. "It will if we survive to testify about what we've discovered here," Michael replied. The sound of approaching voices grew louder as Reed's people broke through the final barriers between them and the chamber. But Michael felt a strange calm as he stood beside the altar, holding Christianity's most sacred relic. Some things were worth protecting even at personal cost, and some stands had to be made regardless of the odds. The crown of thorns fragment caught the light from their LED lanterns as footsteps echoed in the passage leading to their location. And Michael wondered if this was how the original Guardians had felt when they faced persecution and death rather than abandon their sacred duties. Whatever happened next, they had found what their ancestors had died to protect, and they would not let it be carried away by people who saw it only as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Marcus Reed entered the final chamber flanked by 3 armed men, his usual businessman's demeanor replaced by something harder and more desperate. He'd clearly been planning this moment for years, and the presence of Vatican authority had accelerated his timeline beyond what he'd originally intended. "Father Toretti," Reed said with mock courtesy, "I'm afraid you've made a very long trip for nothing. These artifacts belong to families who've been caring for them for centuries, and we've decided it's time to find them more appreciative homes." "These artifacts belong to the Universal Church," Father Toretti replied calmly, positioning himself between Reed and the altar, holding the crown of thorns fragment. "They were placed here under papal protection, and they will remain here under that same protection." Reed's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Papal protection doesn't mean much in rural America, Father. We're a long way from Vatican City, and local law enforcement tends to side with long-time residents over foreign visitors making exotic claims." But even as Reed spoke, Michael could see that the man's attention was fixed on the crown of thorns reliquary with an intensity that went beyond simple greed. There was something almost religious in his fascination with the artifact, as if he understood its spiritual significance even while planning to profit from its theft. "You know what this is," Michael said, studying Reed's expression. "This isn't just about money for you." Reed's mask slipped slightly, revealing something that looked like genuine reverence mixed with bitter resentment. "My family protected these artifacts for 6 centuries. 6 centuries of watching over treasures that could have made us wealthy and powerful, but instead keeping them hidden because of some medieval oath that nobody remembers or cares about anymore. So you decided to break that oath. I decided to honor it properly. These artifacts deserve to be appreciated by people who understand their true value, not moldering in underground chambers where nobody can see them or benefit from them." Emma stepped forward, her historian's instincts recognizing something important in Reed's words. "You're not planning to sell the crown of thorns fragment. You're planning to use it." Reed's smile was cold and triumphant. "Religious artifacts only have power when people believe in them. And there are still millions of people around the world who would follow anyone who possessed physical evidence of Christ's passion." The implications were terrifying. Reed wasn't just a common thief. He was planning to use the most sacred relic in Christianity to establish some kind of religious authority, to build a following based on possession of artifacts that believers would consider spiritually authentic. "That's why you needed the papal authentication markings," Father Toretti realized. "You're planning to claim ecclesiastical authority based on possession of authenticated relics. The Church has been fragmenting for centuries," Reed replied. "Protestant denominations, Orthodox churches, Catholics who think the Pope has abandoned traditional values. People are hungry for authentic spiritual leadership, and they'll follow anyone who can prove a direct connection to Christ himself." Frank Kowalski had been listening in growing horror. "You're talking about starting your own religion. I'm talking about restoring Christianity to its proper authority, led by people who have physical proof of their connection to the divine. These artifacts aren't just museum pieces, they're instruments of spiritual power." Michael understood now why the medieval Guardians had been so secretive about the artifacts they protected. In the wrong hands, relics that commanded the reverence of millions could be used to manipulate and control those same believers. But Reed had made a crucial error in his planning. As he moved toward the altar to claim the crown of thorns fragment, he passed by a stone pillar where Emma had been standing quietly. Hidden in her hand was the small cross that had been among St. Helena's personal possessions. The final artifact they discovered in the deepest chamber, the cross was simple silver, no larger than a man's thumb, but according to the authentication documents, it had been carried by St. Helena herself during her pilgrimage to Jerusalem. More importantly, it bore papal blessing that granted its bearer authority to consecrate ground as sacred space. Emma pressed the cross against the stone pillar and spoke words in Latin that Father Toretti had taught her during their descent into the chamber. The consecration was simple, but binding under canon law. The entire chamber was now officially sanctified as Vatican territory. Beyond the reach of civil authorities or private claims, Reed's expression changed to fury as he realized what Emma had done. That's a meaningless gesture. Ancient rituals don't have legal standing in the modern world. Actually, Father Toretti said with quiet satisfaction, they do. Under international law governing diplomatic territories, this chamber is now legally equivalent to Vatican soil. Any attempt to remove artifacts from here without papal permission constitutes theft from a sovereign nation. Michael felt pieces of the centuries-old puzzle finally coming together as he watched Reed's carefully planned theft begin to collapse around him. 1 year later, St. Helena's Church stood transformed but reverent, its ancient stones carefully restored using techniques that honored both structural integrity and historical authenticity. The restoration had taken 8 months of painstaking work, supervised by Vatican archaeologists and funded through a combination of church resources and donations from Catholic communities around the world who had learned of the site's extraordinary significance. Michael stood in what had once been the main sanctuary, watching morning light filter through new stained glass windows that depicted scenes from St. Helena's life and her discovery of Christian relics in the Holy Land. The windows had been crafted by artisans in Germany using medieval techniques, their colors designed to complement the ancient stonework while providing proper illumination for the sacred space. The church was no longer a ruin, but it wasn't quite a traditional parish either. Father Toretti had worked with Vatican officials to designate St. Helena's as a special pilgrimage site, open to visitors and researchers, but maintained according to strict protocols that protected both the building and the artifacts it housed. The underground chamber system had been completely restored and secured, with climate control systems that would preserve the medieval artifacts for future centuries. But access was carefully controlled. Only credentialed researchers and authorized pilgrims could visit the sacred repositories, and even then only under supervision from trained Vatican custodians. David had overseen much of the construction work, his architectural expertise proving invaluable in balancing historical preservation with modern safety requirements. The project had challenged him in ways that simple residential and commercial buildings never had, forcing him to consider not just structural engineering, but spiritual symbolism and the weight of centuries-old traditions. The dedication ceremony is next week, David said, joining Michael in the restored sanctuary. Father Toretti says they're expecting pilgrims from around the world. The ceremony would formally consecrate the restored church and establish its permanent status as a Vatican-protected pilgrimage site. Cardinals would attend from Rome, along with representatives from Orthodox and Protestant churches who recognized the ecumenical significance of the artifacts St. Helena had collected. Emma had been appointed as the site's official historian and research director, a position that allowed her to continue the scholarly work she'd always dreamed of, while ensuring that the Guardian family traditions were properly documented and preserved. Her research center, housed in a new building adjacent to the church, was already attracting medieval scholars from universities across Europe and North America. "Look at this," Emma said, approaching them with a document that bore official Vatican seals, the formal declaration of the site's protected status. It's being published in multiple languages and distributed to Catholic churches worldwide. The document was more than just official recognition. It was a modern dedication plaque that established the Patterson brothers as hereditary custodians of the site, continuing a tradition that stretched back over 6 centuries. Their names would be recorded in Vatican archives alongside their ancestors who had maintained the Guardian tradition through wars, persecutions, and the gradual secularization of the modern world. "Any word from the trials?" Michael asked. Marcus Reed and 7 associates were facing federal charges for trafficking in stolen religious artifacts, a prosecution that had expanded far beyond Millbrook as investigators traced the network of corrupted Guardian sites. Sarah Martinez had accepted a plea bargain in exchange for testimony that revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise, while Reed himself continued to maintain that he was protecting artifacts from neglect rather than stealing them for profit. Father Toretti says the Vatican lawyers are optimistic about recovering most of the stolen artifacts, Emma replied. The authentication records you found in Reed's storage facility have allowed them to trace items that disappeared from Guardian sites decades ago. The success of the prosecution had also led to renewed contact with other Guardian families whose traditions had been interrupted but not completely lost. Communities in 3 other states had come forward with evidence of similar sites, leading to what Father Toretti called a renaissance of medieval religious archaeology in North America. Frank Kowalski remained in Millbrook, his hardware store becoming an unofficial information center for visitors to the pilgrimage site. His family's Guardian ring was now displayed in the church museum, along with historical documents that told the story of how ordinary families had preserved extraordinary treasures across centuries of change and challenge. As Michael walked through the restored church, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with stewardship of something sacred. The Guardian tradition wasn't just about preserving artifacts, it was about maintaining connection between past and present, between human faith and divine mystery. The church bells, cast by the same German artisans who had created the stained glass windows, chimed the hour with tones that would have been familiar to medieval pilgrims. But the sound also carried forward into a future where new generations would discover the power of protecting something greater than themselves, the document that would define the next generation of guardianship. Was signed on a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after Michael and David had first laid eyes on the ruins of St. Helena's Church. The new Guardian's oath was written in both Latin and English, its language carefully crafted to honor medieval traditions while acknowledging the realities of modern stewardship. Father Toretti administered the oath in the restored sanctuary, with representatives from the Vatican's Pontifical Commission, witnessing the ceremony that would formally establish the Patterson brothers as the hereditary protectors of one of Christianity's most significant pilgrimage sites. The weight of centuries pressed down on Michael's shoulders as he spoke words that bound him and his descendants to a sacred trust that had already survived wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires. We, Michael and David Patterson, descendants of the Guardian bloodline, do solemnly swear before God and His Church to protect and preserve the sacred relics and holy site of St. Helena, to maintain the traditions passed down through generations of faithful servants, and to ensure that future generations may find in this place the same connection to divine mystery that has sustained believers for over 15 centuries. The words felt both ancient and immediate, connecting him to great-uncle Thomas and all the unnamed ancestors who had honored this same commitment across the generations. But they also pointed forward to children and grandchildren who would inherit this responsibility, who would need to find their own ways of balancing sacred duty with the demands of whatever world they would inherit. Emma had spent months researching the traditional language of Guardian oaths, consulting with Vatican scholars and medieval historians to create a ceremony that honored the past while acknowledging contemporary realities. The resulting document was both a legal contract and a spiritual commitment. Recognized by civil authorities as well as church law, David's wife Sarah had driven up from the city with their 2 young children, who watched the ceremony with the solemn attention that children reserve for events they sense are important even when they don't fully understand them. 8-year-old Jessica and 5-year-old Thomas would grow up knowing that their father and uncle were responsible for protecting treasures that people traveled from around the world to see. What happens when we're too old to do this anymore? David had asked during the weeks of preparation for the ceremony the same thing that happened when Uncle Thomas got too old. Michael had replied, "We find the next generation and make sure they understand what they're inheriting." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of new guardian rings, crafted by Vatican artisans using gold donated by Catholic communities worldwide. The rings bore the same designs as the medieval originals, but included contemporary authentication technology that would prevent the kind of forgery and deception that had enabled Reed's criminal enterprise. As the formal ceremony ended and visitors began arriving for the regular afternoon tours, Michael found himself in the underground chamber that had started their entire journey. The crown of thorns fragment rested in its crystal reliquary, surrounded by the other artifacts that had been discovered over 2 years of careful excavation and research. Pilgrims came now from every continent, many of them traveling thousands of miles for the chance to pray in the presence of relics that connected them directly to the early history of their faith. The underground chamber accommodated only small groups at a time, but the waiting list extended months into the future as word of the site's significance continued to spread through religious communities worldwide. "Any regrets?" Emma asked, joining him in the quiet space beneath the church. Michael considered the question carefully. 2 years ago, he'd been a suburban contractor with a comfortable but unremarkable life, worried about quarterly sales reports and mortgage payments. Now he was the hereditary guardian of one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage sites, responsible for artifacts that museums would sell their souls to acquire. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he said finally. "But I can't imagine doing anything else anymore." The guardian tradition had given him something he hadn't known he was missing, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success or financial security. Protecting something sacred, maintaining a trust that connected him to both ancient faith and future generations, had transformed his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The afternoon light filtering down through the church above cast gentle shadows across the artifacts that had been hidden for decades, waiting for the right people to rediscover them and accept responsibility for their protection. Thomas's cryptic letter had spoken of family duty and sacred trust, but it had taken 2 years for Michael to fully understand what those words meant. Some inheritances came with money, others came with purpose. The best ones, Michael had learned, came with both the burden and the privilege of protecting something greater than yourself, something that would matter long after you were gone. Outside, the church bells chimed the hour, calling new pilgrims to prayer and continuing a tradition that would extend far beyond any single generation of guardians.